Welcome to Sailing in the Mediterranean and Beyond podcast. I'm your host. My name is Franz. Welcome back to Sailing in the Mediterranean and Beyond. And I'm going to take you through part of my trip. I'm not sure if this is going to be a multi-part series or I'm going to get through it in one episode. But nonetheless, I'm going to talk about my trip from Indiantown, Florida, all the way up to Hampton, Virginia. And so this was sort of a difficult year. Let's say it right up front. This was not the year I planned on having. I planned on sailing from Indiantown down the intercoastal waterway to Palm Beach and then catch a weather window over to the Bahamas, sailing the Bahamas for a couple months, coming back for a month and then going back, and then continuing offshore up to basically Hampton, Virginia, entering the intercoastal waterway below Cape Hatteras to avoid the bad weather that's known around Cape Hatteras, and then continuing up the intercoastal waterway to Hampton, Virginia. That was the initial plan. So I put together fairly elaborate schedules when I put together these trips, and the planning for these trips takes a lot of time, and arranging crew also takes a lot of time. The logistics, the air flights, everything takes a lot of time. And so I'd pretty much planned out this entire trip. And I flew down to Florida, Sarasota, Florida, on January 13th, 2026. And I met my nephew, Mike, and he picked me up, and also my other crew member, Scott, and took us to the boat in Indiantown. It was about a 2-hour drive from Sarasota to Indiantown, Florida, where the boat had sat on the hard in a field with no water, no electricity at $400 a month. And this was the cheapest boatyard in Florida. And I can't help but comparing this to my experience in the Mediterranean. There was never a boatyard in the Mediterranean that was this third world. This was about, I felt like I'd really dropped through the floor when I got to this boatyard. Sure, I could store my boat. There were fire ants right at the bottom of the ladder. They didn't provide a ladder. I had to go borrow a ladder from somewhere else to actually get up on the boat. There were no services. Literally across from my boat, there was a tree growing out the middle of a power boat that had obviously been there for many years. You walked around this boatyard and there were This I always describe this as this is where boats go to die, Indiantown Marina. And I was happy because it was cheap and it was sort of out of the hurricane zone because they don't really get hurricanes through here. But my batteries were dead, flat out dead when I got there. I couldn't even turn on a light inside the boat because there was no electricity, there was no water. The boat was dirty. It was, and there was algae growing on the side of the boat. My boat looked terrible when I got to the boat. I couldn't put my full cover on because it was in sort of the hurricane zone and they didn't allow you to put covers on the boat. But that was my first time back to the boat in about 9 months. So I wasn't happy with the way the boat looked. I wasn't happy with this boatyard. The only thing good about the boatyard was the price, which by Mediterranean standards was about 3 times what I would be paying in the Mediterranean for being in a boatyard with much better services, with electricity and water to each boat on the hard, where it would normally be on asphalt as opposed to dirt. I just keep comparing this to the boatyards I saw in the Mediterranean, and this definitely did not meet my bare minimum standards. I guess I've been spoiled. I guess I've really been spoiled. Anyway, we got to the boat. The refrigerator I knew it needed some work, and I thought by replacing the electronic module on the refrigerator I could get it to work, but that didn't do it. And I've always said, if you want to work in the marine industry, go get a refrigeration trade. Go learn refrigeration, marine refrigeration. You will be paid well paid for doing this. So at that point in time, I knew I had to replace the compressor on the boat, not the unit inside the actual ice box, but the compressor. And I searched locally. I could not find a compressor locally to replace it with, so I went on to Defender Marine and bought it right from Defender Marine and had it shipped down to the boatyard. That alone delayed me about a week and a half, so I was sitting on the hard in the boatyard. I was eventually launched, but I couldn't go anywhere because I was waiting for the compressor to arrive. So I'm sitting in this boatyard. They have marginal showers. They have a TV you can watch, sort of an area you could watch. And there were a lot of Canadians that basically use this as their summer, or I should say their winter vacation home. They had their boats in the water at this marina. They never took their boats out. They came down and sat on their boats all winter long. And not my definition of sailors, even though they may call themselves sailors. They just sat on the boat and used it as a vacation home. And I saw a lot of this down in Exuma in the Bahamas too. People would just go park their boat and never go anywhere, or go very few places, which is not my style of sailing. I'm a traveler. I'm an adventurer. I like to go see new places. That's not my personality anyway. But they tended to drink a lot every evening. I just didn't understand the draw of this lifestyle that they chose to spend. But they were very pleasant. As a general rule, they were very nice people, and one of them loaned me a pressure washer, which let me take off most of the gunk that had accumulated on my topsides while it sat on this dirt patch in the marina, in the boatyard. Eventually it was launched, and we got the marina to let us stay in the marina at basically about $100 a night while we're waiting for our refrigerator compressor to come. And then finding a refrigerator technician was also very difficult. There were really only two listed that I could get information on, and one was Rock Solid Yacht Services, and that's who I ended up going because they actually agreed to come out. I knew he was overpriced, but I didn't know how overpriced he was. Remember, I'm supplying the compressor, which was about $2,000 from Defender. And then I had to pay for labor as well. Well, I was thinking one technician would be able to do this in maybe 3 or 4 hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours. But the Rock Solid didn't send down one technician. They sent down a technician and an apprentice and charged me full bore for both people. One person could have easily done this. They chose to send 2 people. So they basically came out and spent about 6 hours. No, I would say spent about 4 hours putting in the refrigerator. And that bill came to $1,910.21. I'm looking at that. And so they charged me for travel. They charged me for a fuel surcharge. They charged me for a shop materials fee, even though I wasn't in their shop. And then a marine vendor charge, which I guess went to Indiantown Marina. And then in addition to that, they charged me a 3% credit card fee. And I noticed that a lot down in Florida and South Carolina and North Carolina. They're now charging a 3% credit card fee, which I've never seen in the Western United States or anywhere else I've traveled, but it seems to be pretty common now. So that was the bill for before I even got in the water. That. Also, I had a survey done on the boat, and I had to pay that. That was around $600. And then the marina fees and the boatyard fees. So I'm out probably $4,000 before I've even left the marina. And my plan had been to sail down to Palm Beach and wait for a weather window and sail it over to the Bahamas. But while I was doing my research, I found the Bahamas had suddenly quadrupled their prices for a cruising permit. So if I'd gone over to the Bahamas, they would have charged me about $1,000 just to go sailing in the Bahamas. So I would have probably paid it, but I was not happy about it. And I understand a lot of people have just chosen to sail in Florida or other places because this doesn't go to the work people. This is going to the government. This is just greed by the government to charge people for coming in and visiting and spending money in the Bahamas. And by far, the only thing the Bahamas has going for it, with some exceptions, is tourism. But the weather did not cooperate. I kept looking at predict wind, and the weather was not cooperating with it. And the temperature in the Bahamas and Florida was 40 degrees. I was freezing my little tail off just being down there. It was unseasonably cold. Iguanas were falling out of the trees. And it was cold. The winds were coming from the north. And when you want to cross the Gulf Stream to Florida, that is a no-no. You do not cross the Gulf Stream when the winds are coming from the north, because the Gulf Stream's going north and it builds up dangerous waves and uncomfortable waves. And I kept watching and watching and watching the weather patterns, and the temperature was going down and down and down. And finally, after we finally got the boat in the water and went down the canal, down to the intercoastal waterway, we had to go through one lock to get there. I made a decision that I was not going to go to the Bahamas and instead turn north to go as far north as I could comfortably get without the weather becoming worse and worse and worse. And basically, I decided to go as far north as Cape Canaveral on the intercoastal waterway. And that was it's fairly easy. You just had to stay in the channel and continue north. We anchored a few times getting up there, and not very much of it stands out in my mind. My friend Scott loved to fish, and he was catching fish all the time off the boat. I'm not that much of a fisherman, but we didn't seem to eat the fish. It was sort of catch and release. And if I'm going to be a fisherman, I want to eat the fish I catch, and we didn't do that. At Cape Canaveral, I put the boat in Cape Marina, which is really the only marina around there that is reasonably priced. And by reasonably priced, I mean about $1,000 a month just to keep your boat in the water. And people talk about med mooring. Let me tell you, I do not like Florida mooring at all, where basically you have two lines going off the stern that tie to the dock, and then two posts in the front, which you're supposed to tie two lines off the bow of the boat, one to each pole. I'm not familiar with this, and you have to back down between these poles and throw your lines off the stern to get them around a cleat on the stern. And the first slip the Cape Marina put me into was so narrow that I did a bunch of damage by, no matter how much I tied it off, I was banging up against this metal staircase that came down to the boat. And I put a couple gouges in my teak rub rail. I got them to move me to a bigger slip and, of course, paid more for it. But I left the boat there for 2 months. So I flew away because we were freezing. We were freezing on the boat. Utah was warmer than Florida was, literally warmer than Florida was. And so we got tired of being in this cold weather. There was no hope of it ever warming up while we were there. So we were less than a month on the boat, moving it up to Cape Canaveral, and then both of us flew back. I had to call up all my crews that I ever had arranged for the trip and cancel my flights and give just a heads up. If the the number one airline that flies to the Caribbean islands is American Airlines. If you buy a ticket, they say no refund. And I thought that meant no refund, but you could use a credit to future travel. No refund means no refund. You don't get to use a credit to future travel. So that was money just totally down the toilet. So just a heads up, if you use American Airlines, no refund means nothing. No miles, no credit, no nothing. And that was a surprise to me. And I had already bought a round-trip ticket for me on American Airlines from the Bahamas, the Abacos, to Salt Lake City and back, and then also a round-trip ticket for my wife to fly down and back. So there were 2 round-trip tickets from Salt Lake City to the Abacos, which basically were money down the toilet because American Airlines, I went through the cheapest vendor, which was American Airlines. In hindsight, I probably would have gone through Delta because Delta also flies down there. But that was a surprise. Also, my crews that I invited down, who had already bought their tickets, had to cancel theirs because they were no longer coming down. My plan had been to fly to the Bahamas, sail in the Bahamas for about a month and a half, and then fly home, and then go back down to the Bahamas and spend another month sailing up to Hampton, Virginia. And that was a nice long offshore passage, which would have been fun. But as it turned out, that was not going to happen because the weather was not cooperating. So we left, flew home, and then I had to make new plans. So my new plans were to go back to the boat. So I went back to the boat on March 28th with my wife, my daughter, and my granddaughter to go from Cape Canaveral up to St. Augustine, where my daughter and my granddaughter got off the boat. And then my wife and I continued on to Charleston, South Carolina, where she got off. Interesting thing, I had repainted my bottom 2 years before in Trinidad. So I had decent bottom paint. I'd taken the boat out of the water in Puerto Rico and then put it back in and then sailed up through the Bahamas and into Indiantown, Florida. But apparently the bottom paint was not up to snuff. So I got back to Cape Canaveral. One story before I get to this. So when you go from the Intercoastal Waterway out to Cape Canaveral, you have to go through a lock. It's a big, long lock, probably a couple 100 yards long, and you can tie up on either side of it. And yeah, you really don't go up or down that much, at least not much, if any at all. I think it's basically to keep the water from one mixing with the other, to keep the brackish water from becoming salt water. So we're tied up on the side. Scott and I are tied up on the side. And we're sitting there, and the lock closes behind us. After a few minutes, the lock gate where we're headed out to opens up, and we let go and start slowly motoring out the front end. And the lockmaster said, "Get back over there and tie up again." So we got put in lock jail. He did not want us moving at all, even though there was over 100 yards to get out the gate that was opening. We would not have gotten there by the time the gate was fully open, but the lockmaster put us in lock jail, made us go tie up, closed the gate in front of us again, made us wait there for about 15 minutes, and then finally opened it up again. I think he was on a little bit of a power trip, but that was it. So coming back out with my family, we did not do that. So we stayed tied up, waiting for the gate to open up and waiting for the lockmaster to let us know we could continue. So we're motoring out across this big open lagoon to get back over to the Intercoastal Waterway, which is probably a couple miles across, maybe a little more. And my boat overheats, and we're barely moving. And so the wind is blowing us towards to the west, which is where I needed to go. So I shut down the engine, waited, and then just before we got to the canal, I turned it back on and did not rev it up as high as I had. I normally run the engine at about 2,500 RPM, so I cut this down to 2,200 RPM. and we're only going around 4 knots, and my boat will easily do about 6 knots under power. But we were only doing about 4 knots. Finally, I pull over and jump in the water. And you got to understand, I'm used to gin clear water. All the way through the Mediterranean, anywhere I would go, the water was clear. Clear, clean, beautiful water. The intercoastal waterway is muddy. There is no visibility or very little visibility in the water. I couldn't see anything. I jumped in the water, and it was cold water, but I went and looked and felt the propeller, and there are barnacles all over my propeller. So I had to get a putty knife and go down there and scrape off the propeller as much as I could, and then I went around the boat and scraped off as many of the barnacles that had started to grow there as I could. So, and after that, the boat would still only go about 5 knots, so I knew I needed some real work done on the bottom. I eventually got that done later on in the trip, and we'll get into that a little later on. But for the most part, my boat really was not going more than 5 knots all the way up the intercoastal waterway. The intercoastal waterway is narrow. It is narrow. You have to stay in this channel, and the channel is narrow. And if you get out of the channel, you are running aground. And we ran aground probably, several times, let's just say. And we even anchored one time, and in the morning we were aground because the tide had gone out. The tide ranges all the way on the intercoastal waterway. Some places are as high as 5 or 6 feet. You're always fighting current one way or the other. Sometimes the current's in your favor. Other times it's against you. It is not fun. The intercoastal waterway is not fun. And they have this group called the, I don't know what they call them, the rounders, where they all go up the intercoastal waterway, up the Hudson River, up the Erie Canal, over in the Great Lakes, down the Missouri River to the Tennessee Tom Bigby waterway, and then all the way back around and circle all the way around. And there are always some people doing that. But I just don't understand the attraction in that. You're sitting at just basically driving up a canal, a narrow canal, all the way along. I had a whole different take on East Coast sailing after this. I used to look at charts, look at all these big, wide open sounds, and I thought, wow, it'd be fun to sail in those sounds. Well, most of those sounds are so shallow that you have to stay in the intercoastal waterway or you're going to be running aground. Unless you have a very low draft boat. You know, the power boats, the fishing boats that you'd see going up and down could usually go out, but even they stuck with the intercoastal waterway for the most part. So it's not the great sailing area that I was expecting it to be. Now, I'm in the Chesapeake now, and I haven't really sailed in the Chesapeake. From what I can see on the charts in the Chesapeake, there might be some good sailing in the Chesapeake, and hopefully I'll find that out. But that was basically the first part of the trip. I'm going to go into more detail in the next episode. But I thought I had to get this podcast out and share it with you. My boat is for sale. And I'm getting too old to maintain the boat the way I like to. So in the last few years, I've had to replace the oven. I had to replace the refrigerator. And this year, when I pull it out of the water, I'll be doing the bottom again. But there's always maintenance on a boat. But my boat is currently for sale. It's less than $70,000. And you could easily live aboard this boat. This boat is not made for sitting in marinas, quite honestly. You could do that, but let's face it. I sailed it up in the Northwest for 5 years. I sailed it across the Atlantic, sailed it in the Atlantic for 28 years, sailed it back to Grenada and then to Trinidad and all the way through the Caribbean islands up to Florida. And I have to say, every time I go get on my boat now, I wish I had never brought the boat back from the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, every little town you go into, it's usually fairly inexpensive. Yeah, probably with the exception of Sardinia has become very, very expensive in the marinas in Sardinia. And some of the marinas in Spain have become fairly expensive, but nothing like what I see in Florida and all along the intercoastal waterway. Secondly, when you go into a marina in the Mediterranean, usually that's right at the center of town. That's where the activity is. And there's usually a grocery store almost right at the marina or maybe within a block or two. Every town I went to on the Intercoastal Waterway, it was an anchorage or a marina, and you'd have to get an Uber to go 3 or 4 miles to even find a grocery store. And there's very little of interest right around the marina anyway. It was a marina with no culture, just a place to park your boat. So I was not very impressed with my whole experience on the Intercoastal Waterway. And I felt like it was such a step down compared to the Mediterranean. And I'm sure I'm going to get some pushback on this, but unless you've spent 20 years sailing in the Mediterranean, and most of those years was in Greece and Turkey, you really don't have much comparison. And I would go into the marinas in Turkey, and the showers would be pure marble. There was always somebody cleaning it up right after you got in and out. The U.S. marinas I went into are really a big, big step down from the marinas I saw in Turkey. In Greece, the marinas, I didn't really stay in the marinas in Greece. I would usually pull into the picture-perfect little town harbors, tie up for next to nothing, spend a day or two there, and then go on to the next picture-perfect little harbor. I got tired of all these picture-perfect harbors until I didn't know what I was missing until I got back to the United States again. I'm just going to leave it at that, and I'm going to come back and talk about the second half of the trip from St. Augustine up to Charleston with my wife. And then in Charleston, I had New Cruise join me, and we continued up to Hampton, Virginia. So overall, it was about 1,000 miles, maybe a little more, of the Intercoastal Waterway that I sailed this year. And for the most part, I really wouldn't want to do it again. It was not relaxing. We ran aground several times, and there's one incident I'll tell you about in the next podcast that was fairly interesting. All right, thank you for listening. And if you have comments, write me, franz1@medsailor.com. And if you want to find out more information on the boat, it's currently in Belle Isle Harbor in Hampton, Virginia, in the water. I plan on going back in a few months and sailing a little bit of the Chesapeake and put it on the hard, probably in September. Maybe I'll be going back again July or August to go sailing on the boat. But I'll be putting it up on the hard in September and before it goes back in the water. Hopefully I've sold it, but before it goes back in the water, there'll be a new coat of bottom paint on the bottom of the boat. Thanks for listening. Again, my email is franz1@medsailor.com. If you find any of this content valuable and you would like to support the podcast, the easiest way to do it is to go to the website, medsailor.com, and buy some of the audio lessons I've prepared for learning to sail. I have lessons for the ASA 101, the 103, and the 104. Also, if you'd like to become a Patreon, I'd appreciate it. Just click the link on the website. The website for sailing in the Mediterranean and beyond is medsailor.com. Life is short. In the end, all that really matters is the memories you make. So make a few. Go sailing.
Joel, you want to know something? What? Every now and then, say what the gives you freedom. Freedom brings opportunity. Opportunity makes your future. If you can't say it, you can't do it.